The night Claire Whitfield finally stopped pretending. She was standing in the doorway of her own dining room, holding a bottle of Barolo she'd carried up from the wine cellar herself, still wearing her coat. She had come home early. That was the thing nobody would talk about afterward. Not Richard's mother, not his brother, not the woman sitting at the head of Claire's table in Claire's chair, laughing at something Richard had said. Nobody would mention that Claire had come home 40 minutes early, because her meeting in Hartford had ended ahead of schedule, and she had thought, on the drive back through the October dark, that she might surprise her husband with a nice bottle of wine on a Tuesday. Nobody would mention that, because it would have made what happened next too simple, too human. And the Whitfields had never been comfortable with simple or human. She stood there for 3 full seconds before anyone noticed her. Richard noticed first. She watched his face move through several expressions in less time than it took her to set the bottle down on the sideboard. Surprise. Then a flash of something she recognized only later as calculation. Then, and this was the part that would stay with her for years, a kind of irritation, as if she were the one who had done something wrong by walking into her own home. Claire. He said her name the way you'd say oh when you remembered you'd left something behind. You're back. The woman at the head of the table turned around. She was younger than Claire had expected, though she wasn't sure why she'd expected anything. 30, maybe 32. Dark hair cut close around her jaw, wearing a silk blouse the color of champagne. She had the kind of effortless confidence that Claire had spent 20 years trying to cultivate and never quite managed. The kind that comes from never having had to apologize for taking up space. This is Natalie, Richard said. Natalie Voss. She's been helping with the Alderton account. He said it casually. That was what broke something open in Claire's chest. Not the presence of the woman. Not the candles lit at the table or the good china she hadn't been asked about, but the casualness. The way he introduced this person the way you'd introduce a contractor. As if Claire were the guest who needed to be caught up. Natalie Voss looked at Claire with an expression that was almost sympathetic. Almost. There was something else underneath it, something polished and knowing, and Claire understood in that moment that this woman had been in this house before. More than once. Richard's mother, Judith Whitfield, was seated at Claire's right, the chair she always took when she came for dinner, which was too often and always without calling ahead. Judith was looking at her wine glass. Not at Claire. At the wine glass, as if the burgundy inside it were suddenly the most interesting thing in the room. That told Claire everything she needed to know about how long this had been going on. She didn't say anything. She picked up the bottle of Barolo from the sideboard, looked at it for a moment, a 2016. She'd been saving it. And carried it back toward the kitchen. She heard Richard say her name again, heard the slight edge in it now, but she didn't turn around. In the kitchen she opened a cabinet and put the wine inside. She set her bag on the counter. She took off her coat and folded it over the back of a chair, with the same care she always did, because her hands needed something to do and because old habits are the last things to leave you. Then she went upstairs. She wasn't crying. She noticed that about herself with a kind of distant curiosity. The way you notice you're not cold when you expected to be. She sat on the edge of the bed she'd shared with Richard Whitfield for 19 years, and looked at her hands and felt something shift. The way the ground shifts in those first seconds of an earthquake before you understand what's happening. She had built this life. That was the thought that kept surfacing, quiet and persistent, like something floating up from deep water. She had built this life and she had believed in it, and she had loved the man downstairs, or she had loved who she thought he was, and it was hard to know anymore whether those were the same thing. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Richard. He came in without knocking. It was his bedroom too, she reminded herself, though in that moment it didn't feel like it, and closed the door behind him. He was still holding his wine glass. I should have told you she was coming, he said. Which was not an apology. Claire looked at him. How long? He set his glass on the dresser. Claire, how long, Richard? He was quiet for a moment. In those few seconds she watched him decide something. She could almost see it, the way you can see someone choose which road to take when they've reached a fork. That small, internal pivot. 8 months, he said. 8 months. The Alderton account had started 11 months ago. She'd helped him prepare the pitch deck. She'd stayed up until 1 in the morning going over projected margins with him, because he was anxious and she wanted him to succeed. She'd ordered Thai food and made coffee and told him he was ready when he didn't believe it. I didn't plan for it to become what it is, Richard said. What is it? He didn't answer that. He walked to the window and looked out at the backyard, at the darkness beyond the patio lights. She understands the work in a way that's hard to explain. Claire let that sit in the room between them for a moment. I understand your work, she said. I have a degree in finance. I ran the household accounts for 19 years. I sat through every dinner with every client you needed me to sit through. I know your work. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. He turned from the window, and here was the moment. She'd think about this later. Turn it over in her mind the way you turn over an interesting stone. Here was the moment where a different man might have broken down, or begged, or said something real. Richard did none of those things. Richard Whitfield squared his shoulders the way he always did when he was preparing to say something he decided to say, and he said, "Maybe we need to think about what we both want going forward." She heard him. She understood every word. She nodded once. "Okay," she said. And then she went into the bathroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the tub and breathed. She didn't come back downstairs that night. She didn't eat. She heard Natalie Voss leave sometime around 9. Heard the murmur of voices at the door. Heard Judith's particular way of clicking her heels on the hardwood. She heard Richard come back upstairs and go into the guest room. His choice, not hers. And she lay in the dark of their bedroom with her eyes open and began very quietly to think. Because here was the thing about Claire Whitfield that Richard had never fully understood. In 19 years of marriage, she had never been, a woman who acted from emotion. She felt things deeply, more deeply than most people knew. But feeling and acting were different processes for her, always had been. She could be devastated and still be thinking clearly. She could be heartbroken and still be watching the board. She had a law degree she'd never used professionally because Richard had needed her in other ways. She had a mind for numbers that she'd channeled entirely into his benefit. She had spent the better part of 2 decades making herself useful in ways that were invisible. The way foundations are invisible, you don't notice them until something falls. She thought about all of this calmly, in the dark, and by the time the light came back into the sky she had a general outline of what came next. She didn't move quickly. That was important. Moving quickly was how people made mistakes, made it emotional, gave the other side something to point to. She went about her days with the same quiet competence she'd always brought to everything. The board dinners, the charity events, the quarterly reviews of the family's investment portfolio that Richard technically oversaw but that Claire actually managed. She smiled at the right times. She asked appropriate questions. She also called her college roommate Monica, who was now a family law attorney in New Haven. "Tell me everything," Monica said, "and leave nothing out." So she did. Monica listened without interrupting, which was something Claire had always loved about her, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You've been managing the investment accounts? For 11 years. Richard has signatory authority but I do the actual oversight. He doesn't like spreadsheets. Does he know that you know that?" "No," Claire said. "I don't think he's thought about it at all." Monica was quiet again. Then, "Claire, do you have access to documentation? Records, account statement?" "I have everything." Another pause. "Okay," Monica said. "Don't move anything yet. Don't change anything, just get it somewhere safe. And then come see me." Claire spent the following weekend going through 19 years of organized files. She'd always been organized, it had just never felt like a weapon before, and she scanned everything onto an encrypted drive and mailed a copy to Monica, and kept another copy in a safe deposit box at a branch of her bank that Richard never used. She was thorough, she was quiet, she took her time. In the meantime, Richard moved back into the master bedroom as if nothing had been decided. As if the conversation they'd had been merely theoretical. He was careful around her in the way that people are careful when they're not sure how much the other person knows or how much they care. He brought her coffee in the morning. He asked about her day. He touched her shoulder once in the kitchen with a kind of tentative warmth that made her want to put down whatever she was holding very carefully before she responded. She did. She put down the spatula and she turned around and she looked at her husband, who was handsome in the way he'd always been handsome, and who had the same eyes she'd fallen in love with in her late 20s. And she said, "You should figure out what you want, Richard. Not what's convenient, what you actually want." He looked at her with something she couldn't read. "I want this to work," he said. "No," she said, and turned back to the stove. "You want it to be easy." He didn't say anything after that. Judith called that week as Claire had known she would. Judith Whitfield operated on a schedule that felt like clockwork. She circled situations the way birds circle before landing, watching for the right moment. "I think," Judith said over the phone in her careful voice that always sounded like she was choosing words from a very small, expensive inventory, "that you may be taking this harder than necessary." Claire sat at her kitchen table with her coffee. Richard has always had a great deal of energy. You know that about him. These things sometimes happen to men in his position. It doesn't mean Judith, Claire said. "Yes? Did you know about Natalie Voss before I did?" The silence was a fraction of a second too long. "That's a complicated question," Judith said. "It's actually very simple." Another pause. "I thought it was better to let him manage his own affairs." "I see," Claire said. "Claire, I only mean." "Thank you for calling," Claire said and set down the phone. She sat for a while after that, not because she was upset, though she was, but because something was clarifying, the way water clarifies when you stop stirring it and let it settle. She thought about all the dinners she'd hosted for Judith, all the birthdays remembered, the gifts selected with care, the times she'd stayed in the room when she'd wanted to leave, stayed pleasant when she'd wanted to be honest. She thought about how much of her energy over 19 years had gone toward maintaining the appearance of a family that, it turned out, had never fully accepted her as its own. She called Monica that afternoon. I'm ready, she said. Okay, Monica said. Let's talk about next steps. The papers were filed on a Thursday, which Claire chose because Thursdays were when Richard had his standing lunch with his business partner, and didn't get back until mid-afternoon. She wanted the house to herself for a few hours. She wanted to sit in her own home without having to manage anyone's reaction to anything. When Richard came home and found the envelope on the kitchen counter, he stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a very long time without moving. She knew because she was in the living room, reading, and she could hear that particular quality of stillness. He came into the living room with the envelope open in his hand. His expression was one she hadn't seen before on him. Stripped of its usual management, its usual performance. He looked like someone who had expected a road to continue and had arrived at the edge of a cliff. You're serious? He said. Yes, Claire. He sat down across from her. He put the envelope on the coffee table. He pressed his hands together in that gesture he had when he was trying to collect himself. If this is about Natalie, it's about everything, she said. Natalie is just the part you didn't bother to hide. He looked at her. I don't understand you, he said, and she heard something real in it, genuine bewilderment. I know, she said, and she meant it without cruelty. He hadn't understood her. She'd spent years making herself comprehensible to him, and it hadn't worked, not really, and at some point that had stopped being her failure and become simply a fact. The proceedings took several months, which is how these things go when there is property and accounts and a family business, and a mother-in-law who calls Monica's office twice trying to schedule an unsolicited meeting. Judith's calls went unreturned. The family business, it emerged through the documentation Claire had compiled, had been using a set of expense accounts in ways that hadn't been properly disclosed. This wasn't Claire's doing. It had been there in the numbers for years, waiting to be looked at directly. Monica's forensic accountant looked at it directly. Richard called her the night that particular matter came to light. He wasn't angry, which surprised her. He sounded tired. I didn't think you'd go this far, he said. I didn't do anything, she said. Those are records. I didn't create them. I went to a lawyer, she said. I followed the process, that's all I did. He was quiet then. My mother is very upset, I'm sure she is, she thought. We all thought that you'd be reasonable about this. Claire looked out the window at the November yard, at the bare trees against the late sky. I am being reasonable, she said. Reasonable doesn't mean what you thought it meant. He had no answer for that. The settlement, when it came, was thorough. Monica was very good at her job, and the documentation Claire had gathered over all those years turned out to be more useful than either of them had initially understood. Claire didn't take everything she could have. That was a choice she made consciously, not out of generosity toward Richard but because she didn't need everything. She needed enough to start. She'd always been good at enough. She kept the house. She hadn't expected to fight for it. She'd expected to let it go, to let the whole weighted architecture of that life go. But when it came down to it, she found she didn't want to. It was her house. She had chosen the light fixtures and the kitchen tile, and the garden that came back every April, whether anyone was paying attention or not. She had built a life inside those walls, and the life hadn't worked out, but the walls had nothing to do with that. She had the locks changed on a Saturday in January. It was very cold. She stood on the front porch and watched the locksmith work and drank her coffee and felt the cold air come in off the river. And she thought about how strange it is. The way things end. How there's no sound to it, usually. How the big things finish the same ways the small things do. With paperwork and phone calls and a locksmith on your porch who doesn't know anything about you. Her neighbor, a woman named Paulette who she'd never been particularly close to, came across the yard that morning with a container of soup. I heard, Paulette said simply. And then she didn't say anything else, just handed over the soup and went back to her own house, and Claire stood there holding it and found, to her mild surprise, that her eyes were stinging. Not from the cold. She got a call from Judith in February, the first direct contact since the proceedings. Judith sounded smaller on the phone than Claire remembered, which might have been age or might have been circumstance. She said that she hoped they could remain. She paused here, searching cordial. We can remain civil, Claire said. I don't know about cordial. The family, Judith, Claire said, not unkindly but without softness. I was in that family for 19 years. I worked for that family. I kept things running for that family. And when your son decided to make different choices, you sat at my table and said nothing. So I think you understand why I don't have a strong interest right now in what's good for the family. Judith was quiet for a long moment. Then she said in a different voice, smaller, almost unrecognizable, I should have said something. To him. Claire hadn't expected that. She held the phone and let it land. Yes, you should have. That was all. She didn't offer reassurance. Didn't say it's okay. Didn't fill in the silence with the kind of gracious cushioning she'd spent 2 decades providing. She just let it be what it was. She started consulting that spring. The law degree she'd shelved. The financial expertise she'd applied only to Richard's benefit. It turned out there were firms looking for exactly what she had, and she had it in depth. The first contract came through a colleague she'd known peripherally for years who'd always seemed interested in her thinking when they'd spoken at events. "I always wondered why you weren't working," he said, when she met with him. "I was working," she said. "Just not for money." She meant it without bitterness. The work she'd done had been real even when it had been invisible. She'd gotten very good at a great many things. She was just at 51, finally getting paid for them. She heard things about Richard and Natalie Voss through the ordinary currents of a small city social life. The kinds of things you pick up without trying to, in grocery stores and at dinner tables. That things between them had become complicated. That the Alderton account had fallen through. That the business, without the management Claire had quietly provided for years, was operating with less efficiency than it used to, which Richard had not anticipated. She didn't feel glad about this. Or she did sometimes in a small private corner of herself, and then she moved on. She had too many other things to think about. Her friend Dana, who she'd been close to in college and grown closer to again since the divorce, took her to Sedona for a long weekend in April. They hiked and ate too much and stayed up late talking the way you can only talk with someone who knew you before you were married. Before you were anybody's wife. Dana said, at one point, out on the balcony of their rented house with the red rock lit up in the dusk, "You seem different." "Different how?" "Lighter." Dana looked at her. "You seem like you're taking up your own space." Claire thought about that for a moment. "I think I forgot it was mine to take," she said. She drove home from Sedona with the windows down through the desert, through Arizona in April with the air warm and smelling of something she couldn't name. And she played music she'd always liked, but never really listened to in the car because Richard preferred news radio. She thought about Paulette's soup and Monica's voice on the phone saying, "Okay, let's talk about next steps." She thought about 1,000 small moments of her marriage. The good ones, which had been real, and the ones that hadn't been what she thought they were, which had also been real. She thought about what it meant to know the difference. Finally, between what you'd built and what had been built for you. She got home at dusk, the light going pink over the river, and pulled into her own driveway and sat for a moment before getting out. The garden was coming up, it always did without being asked. The things you plant and tend come back for you even after everything else has changed. She got out of the car and unlocked her door, her lock, her key, and went inside.